In 19th century America, education was a simple and direct part of everyday life, integrated into family routines, domestic work, and the practical needs of expanding communities. In rural villages and small towns, the sound of the school bell marked the beginning of the mornings, bringing together children of different ages in single wood-fired rooms, where learning was conducted by young teachers, often with limited training but socially respected. Basic literacy, elementary arithmetic, and reading aloud moral texts formed the core of common education. In this environment, studying was not an abstract project for the future, but an extension of the daily effort to understand the immediate world, keep accounts, write letters, and participate in local civic life. It was in this context that religious groups began to reflect on education as an instrument for cultural preservation and the transmission of values. Among them, Seventh-day Adventists emerged as an organized minority, largely composed of families of rural origin, artisans, small merchants, and farmers from the northern United States. For these families, public school offered access to basic knowledge, but also reflected social customs and calendars that did not always coincide with their habits. Adventist education was not born as a system planned from the beginning, but as a gradual response to this reality, shaped by local experiences, practical trials, and continuous adjustments. In the early years, the instruction of Adventist children took place mostly at home or in small, makeshift rooms next to churches. Parents assumed the role of educators, using common books of the time, newspapers, and the Bible as reading material without standardized curricula. The immediate goal was not to train specialists, but to ensure that children knew how to read, write clearly, calculate correctly, and develop personal discipline. Study was interspersed with manual labor, whether in the fields, in the workshop, or in household chores, reinforcing the idea that intellectual knowledge and physical effort were part of the same daily experience. As the movement grew and became institutionally structured, broader concerns arose. Young Adventists sought advanced training in non-Adventist academies and colleges, returning with useful skills but also with cultural habits considered foreign to their communities of origin. This tension was not unique to Adventists, but common to various religious groups of the time, who saw higher education both as an opportunity and as a risk of accelerated social assimilation. The discussion about Adventist schools began to gain traction in assemblies and periodicals, always anchored in practical accounts and observations of daily life and not in abstract educational theories. In 1874, the founding of Battle Creek College in Michigan represented a milestone in this process. Located near the main Adventist administrative center of the time, the college did not emerge as a university in the modern sense, but as a hybrid institution, combining academic teaching, moral formation, and manual labor. Students participated in agricultural activities, campus maintenance, and practical workshops, integrating study and work as part of the daily routine. Classrooms were simple, resources limited, and faculty often held multiple positions, reflecting the denomination's modest economic conditions. The Battle Creek experience profoundly influenced the nascent Adventist educational model. The school functioned as a community, where schedules, meals, study, and work were organized in an integrated way. Learning was not accelerated, nor guided by national standardized exams, but by the observable progress of students in reading, writing, reasoning, and practical skills. Records from the time indicate that many students alternated periods of study with interruptions for paid work, returning when possible, a reflection of the financial limitations common at the time. In this context, Ellen G. White appears in the records as an attentive observer and chronicler of ongoing educational experiences. Her letters and articles describe schools, student habits, and administrative challenges, frequently commenting on the need for a balance between intellectual study and useful work. These texts did not function as formal pedagogical manuals, but as reflections based on visits, conversations, and direct observations of the daily functioning of the institutions. They circulated widely among leaders and teachers, influencing practical decisions about curricula, discipline, and school organization. Throughout the final decades of the 19th century, Adventist schools began to multiply in different states, especially in the Midwest and on the East Coast. They were mostly small institutions linked to local communities with few teachers and small class sizes. Secondary education was still rare and higher education remained accessible to only a few. Even so, these schools created an informal training network that kept pace with the demographic growth of the movement, adapting to regional conditions and the immediate needs of the families involved. Thus, Adventist education in early America did not develop as a uniform or centralized system, but as a set of local practices connected by shared experiences and written records, preparing the ground for broader transformations that would become visible in the following decades. At the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, daily life in the United States underwent gradual transformations, noticeable first in small changes in routine. The advancement of railroads shortened distances, mail became more regular, and newspapers reached rural areas more frequently. Even so, for most Adventist families, the rhythm of life remained marked by agricultural work, the seasons, and a domestic economy that demanded constant prudence. Education in this context needed to adapt to the limitations of time, financial resources, and labor, while remaining close to the concrete reality of these communities. The Adventist schools that emerged during this period directly reflected this environment. Many functioned as rural boarding schools located far from urban centers on agricultural land acquired at low cost. The choice of the countryside was not only economic, but also practical. The land offered food, daily occupation for the students, and a source of supplementary income for the maintenance of the institutions. The school day began early, with tasks assigned before classes, such as milking, preparing the soil, cleaning dormitories, or maintaining fences. These activities were not seen as interruptions to learning, but as an integral part of the student's education. The curriculum of these schools remained basic in its structure. Reading, writing, mathematics, history, and geography formed the academic core, taught using books widely used in the American educational system of the time. There was not yet a significant production of original teaching materials, and teachers adapted content according to their skills and personal experience. Teaching was mostly expository, with memorization, reading aloud, and written exercises common practices in schools of the period. Discipline was simple and direct, based more on predictable routine than on extensive regulations. As these institutions became more established, there was a growing concern about teacher training. Many of the first Adventist educators were former students who demonstrated an aptitude for teaching and took on classrooms with little formal preparation. This reality was not uncommon in America at the time, but it generated internal debates about educational quality and consistency. Conventions and regional meetings began to include discussions about teaching methods, class hours, and school organization, always anchored in practical accounts and local experiences, and not in imported theoretical models. In this process, the role of Adventist publications was significant. Magazines and bulletins provided detailed accounts of how the schools functioned, describing schedules, financial challenges, and observed results in student behavior. These texts circulated among distant communities, creating a kind of indirect dialogue between educators who rarely met in person. Successful experiences were discussed, while difficulties were openly exposed, revealing a system under continuous construction, subject to constant adjustments. The geographic expansion of Adventist schools followed the internal migration of the faithful. As families moved westward or to new agricultural areas, the need for local institutions arose. Thus, small academies were established in states such as Iowa, Nebraska, and California, each adapted to regional conditions. In some, agricultural work predominated. In others, printing, carpentry, or sewing workshops took on greater importance. This diversity reflected not a lack of direction, but an attempt to keep education aligned with the skills necessary for local survival. Ellen G. White's presence continued to be recorded during this period primarily through correspondence and travelogues. Her writings describe visits to functioning schools, observations of student routines, and comments on the relationship between study, work, and health. These records were read as testimonies of what was being experienced, not as uniform decrees. Teachers and administrators often interpreted these observations in light of their own circumstances, applying them flexibly. From a social perspective, Adventist schools also functioned as spaces for community interaction and formation. Young people from different regions spent long periods together, sharing work, simple meals, and study in relatively isolated environments. Friendships, marriages, and networks of cooperation emerged in these contexts, strengthening group cohesion over time. The school was not just a place of instruction, but a microcosm of rural Adventist life, with its customs, limitations, and expectations. Financially, the sustainability of these institutions remained fragile. They depended on modest tuition fees, student labor, and occasional donations. National economic crises, such as the recessions of the late 19th century, directly affected enrollment and school maintenance. Records indicate periods of temporary closure, reduced courses, and frequent reorganizations. Even so, the persistence of these institutions demonstrates the value attributed to education as an essential element for the group's continuity in a rapidly transforming country. As the new century began, Adventist education in the United States found itself at a point of transition, sustained by practices inherited from the previous century, and pressured by broader social and educational changes that were beginning to become visible on the historical horizon. At the beginning of the 20th century, education in the United States began to reflect broader changes in the emerging industrial society. Cities were growing, factories were attracting workers, and the public education system was undergoing gradual reforms, with greater curricular standardization and increased emphasis on secondary education. For many Adventist families, especially those still connected to rural areas, these transformations were observed from a distance, filtered through newspapers, letters, and occasional experiences of contact with urban centers. In this context, Adventist schools needed to manage growing expectations without losing touch with the everyday reality that had shaped them from the beginning. The Adventist academies established during this period began to slowly expand their educational offerings. Subjects such as natural sciences, basic accounting, and teacher training began to be included in the curriculum, albeit modestly. Laboratories were simple, often improvised with limited equipment that had been reused for many years. Scientific teaching did not seek innovation, but rather familiarity with essential concepts that would allow students to understand common phenomena, such as soil cultivation, personal hygiene, and the basic functioning of agricultural machinery. Learning remained strongly linked to direct observation and practical repetition. The students' daily lives remained organized around a predictable routine. Rigid schedules regulated waking up, meals, work, and study. Time was treated as a scarce resource to be used sparingly. Professors, often residing on campus, participated in this routine alongside the students, creating a less hierarchical relationship than in large urban institutions. Faculty authority was based more on daily interaction and personal example than on academic titles or formal distance. During this period, the training of Adventist teachers gained greater institutional attention. Specific courses began to be offered in some academies, preparing young people to work in primary schools throughout the country. These programs emphasize simple teaching methods, the organization of multi-grade classrooms, and adaptation to limited resources. The expectation was that the teacher would be able to teach various subjects, manage the local school, and in many cases engage in community activities beyond the classroom. This versatility reflected the needs of small and dispersed communities. The circulation of educational ideas also intensified. Adventist educators followed national debates on pedagogy through secular magazines and regional meetings. Although there was interest in more modern methods, the adoption of these practices was cautious. The central concern remained practical applicability and compatibility with the economic realities of schools. Thus, reforms were tested on a small scale, evaluated over time, and adjusted according to the results observed in student behavior and performance. Ellen G. White's writings from this period continue to offer an indirect portrait of these transformations. In letters and manuscripts, she describes impressions of functioning schools, commenting on student fatigue, workload, and the need for a balance between physical and intellectual effort. These records are valuable not because they present a closed system of ideas, but because they document concerns common to American education at the time, such as health, discipline, and the usefulness of acquired knowledge. Socially, Adventist schools came to play an even more defined role in the formation of internal leadership. Many administrators, editors, nurses, and teachers within the movement received their basic or secondary education in these institutions. The school functioned as a space for mutual observation, where aptitudes were identified and future trajectories began to take shape informally. This process was not centrally planned, but emerged naturally from prolonged interaction in relatively isolated environments. Despite these advances, tensions persisted. Some parents questioned the time dedicated to manual labor, while others feared that expanding the curriculum would distance young people from the simple life they knew. These discussions appeared in administrative minutes and private correspondence, revealing a delicate balance between preserving habits and adapting to the demands of a changing country. There was no full consensus, only continuous adjustments shaped by local circumstances. By the end of the first decade of the 20th century, Adventist education in the United States had a more defined character than in its early days. Although it remained diverse and decentralized, it bore the marks of the previous century, while at the same time beginning to respond cautiously to the pressures of a new social and educational context that would become even more evident in the following years. In the decades that followed, especially from the 1910s and 1920s onwards, Adventist education in the United States coexisted with a more clearly urban, industrial, and institutionalized country. World War I, the expansion of cities, and the growth of public secondary education altered social expectations regarding schooling. Diplomas began to carry more professional weight, curricula became more uniform, and education was increasingly seen as a path to social mobility. For Adventist communities, this scenario represented both opportunity and challenge, requiring careful adaptations without completely breaking with already established practices. Daily life in Adventist schools during this period reveals a more systematic organizational effort. Schedules were recorded with greater precision, academic reports became more frequent, and school administration began to adopt procedures inspired by broader educational models. Even so, life on campus remained simple. Shared dormitories, basic meals, and long periods of manual labor continued to be part of the student experience. The school remained a space where life was intensely shared, marked by predictable routines and lasting interpersonal relationships. The curriculum, although expanded, maintained a pragmatic character. Vocational training courses in areas such as nursing, typography, agriculture, and elementary education gained greater prominence, reflecting the concrete needs of the denomination and the job market of the time. Academic education advanced, but rarely distanced itself from practical application. Knowledge was valued above all for its immediate usefulness, whether in personal sustenance or community service. This approach differentiated these institutions from urban colleges more focused on theoretical specialization. Teacher training became more structured, with regular programs and minimum completion requirements. Even so, many teachers continued to learn through daily practice, adjusting methods according to student responses. The Adventist classroom remained a